Certainly my sense is that China and COMAC is going to be about the potential geopolitical risks of using non-Chinese suppliers and having its own internal capacity. Overall, a massively expanding airline and air travel market with quite a few challenges, not least in terms of supply and modernization of power plant and what fuels those power plants.
So you have to develop airports, develop civil aviation oversight capabilities in all of these countries, particularly in the global market demands that older aircraft will have to fly longer. 777s and A380s or Airbus 330 family aircraft, they will have to stick around a bit longer because the output for new aircraft is not quick enough. And I think also there to basically ensure that the track record of aviation when it comes to safety stays at the incredibly high standard it is. Training is hugely important here, ensuring that the oversight is also guaranteed and continue to be at the level it is right now.
Welcome to the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast, the podcast that introduces you to ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. My name is Barry Eustance, and I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Hi everybody, it's Barry Eustance here from the Success Consultancy with the Just Great People podcast. Welcome to Remco Althuis again for the promised second podcast. This time it's going to be about the world in 2050. Remco's identified some significant demand and capacity misalignments already, as you'll reference in our previous podcast, the link to which will be with the notes to this podcast. And so with no further ado, I'll let Remco start the conversation as a starter for 10, so you can get a sense of where these demand and capacity disconnects in the airline industry in particular relate to the demographics and the new world order. Remco, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Hi, Barry. Good morning. Thanks for having me again. Yes, like I alluded to in our previous conversation, there'll be a few main drivers that'll continue to increase global aviation. Obviously, the growing population of the world, and also the global wealth development in the world. Because if you look at the current main aviation markets and how many people travel and the population versus kind of the GDP size. So here you see number of air travel trips versus GDP per capita. Yeah, so this is from Our World in Data, one of my favorite websites. And here you see on the one axis, this is a logarithmic scale. On the bottom, you see the GDP per capita. And then on the left side, you see the number of trips per capita. And so on the top right corner, Iceland, a wealthy country, but also an island. Icelanders make the most trips per capita. And of course, if you look at each of these regions, and then you look at the left bottom, you see that obviously the countries with a lower GDP, the inhabitants of those countries also travel less. So, in the middle, you have China with a GDP per capita of 18,000. This is 2021, 0.46 trips per capita. And then if you look at some of the other countries, you'll see countries around the world, especially African countries with the growth population, but also the growth in wealth, move towards the top right. Obviously from a very low base, Nigeria, GDP per capita, and then number of trips per capita, but it's still very small. But with the GDP, with the wealth, so a higher income and more people, obviously, then the number of trips will increase. That's something that we will definitely see happening.
So the clear linkage, as you mentioned in our last podcast, is between GDP per capita and the amount of demand there is going to be for air travel. And this is a statistic that perhaps doesn't necessarily occur to people, that, as you said, the ability to travel is based upon discretionary income, which is driven by GDP per capita. I was staggered by the statistic you gave where there were only, and I say only 65 wide bodies in India with this massive pent-up demand and these service agreement restrictions, I mean, almost throttling restrictions between China and India.
It's 42 a week, so 6 per day, is the air service agreement that determine how many weekly flights are allowed from either side. And obviously, on the one side of the spectrum, you have open skies, is anyone can fly anything, and on
Anywhere,
the other,
anytime.
and so for instance, between Europe and the USA, there's an open skies agreement. But on the other hand, there's also bilaterals which are quite restricted, and also there to protect some of the countries. And I always think of it, bilateral agreements, as that's something that countries have in a drawer somewhere. And then, of course, when it develops, all of a sudden, for instance, Qatar Airways, or Qatar for that sense. I mean, there was no major Qatar airline. And when basically oil was discovered, or gas in the case of natural gas in the case of Qatar, a lot of the developments were done by obviously Western countries that came in and brought in expats and expertise. And then you had a flight, KLM, maybe British Airways flew to Doha, and then Qatar decided to launch an airline. And then, of course, they say, hey, I have an entitlement because KLM, you've been flying here forever. Now I would also like to fly to Amsterdam, please. And that is happening the world over, because it's bilateral, but a lot of these agreements are very heavily one-sided. So there's only one side flying, the other side, for whatever reason, hasn't had the capabilities or the capital required to start an airline. I mean, a case in point, Nigeria. Nigeria is a country that has natural resources. It has oil. It has a very fast-growing population. Its GDP is developing, and obviously with that comes the requirements and the demand for air travel outbound, and so that will continue to grow quickly. I think if you look at it from a global level right now, Asia Pacific is where IATA forecasts that the growth will be the largest in, let's say, the decades to come. Because of India and because of a country like Vietnam, but also Indonesia. I think what the previous graph indicated, obviously, yes, discretionary income, so GDP drives aviation, but also the environment. People from an island fly more than people that have very, very good connections. For instance, like in the Netherlands, I think the average Dutchman flies 1.6 times a year, or That's also because there's trains everywhere, and it's a very small country, and so you can drive very easily to Germany and Belgium and France and Spain and those places.
And the potential here is that for those developing countries where there just isn't the capital for a local airline, and Nigeria being a classic example, where there was a Nigeria Airways and other startups that didn't actually gain traction. The routes themselves then become extremely lucrative for the external operators.
Yes.
For example, British Airways, Virgin, and others, with very high yields on those routes. How do you see the potential throttling of that demand curve by just lack of supply from aircraft manufacturers? How do you perceive that restriction being eased to actually more closely match capacity with demand?
Well, not quickly. I was looking at some other statistics, and for instance, if you look at the previous decade, so basically up until 2020, the annual increase of wide bodies globally, the deliveries, has sat at about 16% per year. So basically, the average growth rate for that decade of new aircraft being added to the capacity was 16%. In the past 5, so basically this decade, so to speak, we only sit at 4%. So the number of wide bodies that's being added comes at a much slower pace, which means that the production needs to be ramped up, and that of course is also linked to certification. That means that the 777X, which is the aircraft that will help grow the market, but also replace a lot of older aircraft still is waiting certification. And once it is certified, the production will need to be ramped up. The most output of wide bodies onto the market from Boeing and Airbus was a decade ago. So that's when they had the most capabilities to deliver aircraft, and it is now at a much smaller pace. So, and that means
16% growth as it was basically doubling the market every 5 years.
Correct.
And at 4%, you've slipped that back to 15 years. That's a doubling in 15 years. That's a massive change.
Yeah.
The other factors we need to consider here are the geopolitical considerations, and we were referring to Ray Dalio from Bridgewater's outstanding book, Principles for Navigating the Changing World Order, where he sees the ascendancy of China and perhaps the descendancy of the United States, which may have caught attention of at least some people in the United States. And he wrote that book back in 2021. COMAC and others have started to make inroads, and we're starting to see, I think, this polarization or at least segmentation of the global market, where you've kind of got the BRICS countries looking at potentially a new currency, a gold-backed currency potentially. Do you see that someone like COMAC the Chinese aircraft manufacturer, can actually start to make inroads into the aeroplane supply throttling that's going on at the moment? Is that feasible? Is there enough time? Will it make a difference? What are your thoughts?
I think definitely. I mean, they have a working narrow body now, the COMAC 19, and the orders sit at 1,000. I think the Chinese are extremely keen to keep developing this, and I'm absolutely convinced they have the capabilities. And so let's see how this deliveries of this aircraft evolve in the next couple of years. And I think obviously the Chinese airlines are the first customers for this aircraft. But given China's presence in other countries, particularly Africa, I think that there is obviously a market for it. And there's also a desire, political will to do so. The difficulty with aviation or with aircraft is that, okay, you can produce an aircraft and then sell it, but after sales are equally important. So you also then have to set up a local logistics hub for spare parts and also do a lot of knowledge transfer to ensure that these aircraft not only fly, but they're also being maintained. Because what would not work is that you would have to go back to the center all the time. If you look at the former Bombardier, now the Airbus 220 aircraft, which Airbus sold, I think one of the reasons why Bombardier had difficulty selling that aircraft globally is because there were limited capabilities for a global reach in after sales. In that sense, it requires a very, let's say, long strategy, long-term vision. I think the Chinese will have that for sure.
For sure.
And then it is building up the capabilities and ensuring that, and it has to be a good aircraft. And then also the support capabilities need to be arranged and managed.
And that's absolutely critical, isn't it? We were also discussing the potential issues with mating a new airframe with a new engine and the support issues. We're looking now for close to 100% dispatch reliability, aren't we? I mean, it's 99.678 or 9 that we're looking at, and anything deviating from that makes the thing almost unworkable. Yeah. So that is going to be a test. But it is, I can see that there is that potential for COMAC to start, because of the Chinese propensity to play the infinite game rather than the short-term game. They're not chasing the next quarter's earnings. They're taking a very long-term view, and that's played out to their advantage commercially and geopolitically.
Yeah, and obviously some industries, like EVs, for instance, they really say this is a key industry that they want to focus on, it. They want to push, and they make good cars for let's say, an interesting value proposition. And I think they've now made inroads in narrow-body aircraft. Obviously, a wide-body would take a tremendous amount of research and development and investment. So that's not something that could happen overnight. But I would be keen to see if they have that vision and also how it would pan out. But I think, obviously, looking at the numbers, the demand will be there.
And touching on EVs, as we did in our previous conversation, the view on EVs and air traffic management capability to cope with those. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think as the tragic incident in the DC showed, some of these airspaces are very, very busy, and it becomes very difficult to manage. And so the computing power that you need to keep an eye out for all these moving parts and ensure that basically the highways in the sky are properly managed and that there won't be any incidents is a big challenge, I think, because, at the smaller, let's say, the drone-like small person, let's say city center to airport or small elements, small distances in cities, for instance, there will be a lot of them flying around. And I'm not quite sure yet if we have the capabilities to manage that adequately right now.
No, and I share that concern. And certainly some of the reports I've seen from very substantial organizations who have put proposal papers forward, when you get to the all-weather capability of these EVs, the icing is a factor for a lot of places. For example, the eastern seaboard of the United States. And can be disastrous, as we saw with the Air Florida incident on the Potomac Bridge, where Air Florida hadn't de-iced correctly on that occasion. And the paper that I saw was basically talking about hydrophobic application of liquids onto the rotors to actually keep the things free of ice, while they were, quote, in the icing layer. Well, the icing layer in the eastern seaboard goes a long way further higher than any EVs likely to fly on a metropolitan route. So the thing is going to be icing conditions pretty well the whole time. Flown by whom? And if the question is autonomously, well, that's fine. There is that capability, but you've then got the energy density in the batteries to provide the necessary capability to perhaps electrically de-ice, because hydrophobic fluids don't necessarily provide that capability for the sort of time that they're going to be used, particularly on a spinning rotor. So I see all sorts of problems. What I do see potentially is that the hybrid solution, where you have, for example, hydrogen fuel cells, and hydrogen-powered aircraft, I think has got merit. But again, your thoughts would be really, really welcome. Certainly Airbus pretty well have been moving down that line with their Zero-E product line. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we touched about this the other day. I mean, the technology that basically delivers the power for the aircraft, these power plants. This technology is almost it's 80 plus years old, and we've had several iterations, and so the new generation of engines, of power plants, basically enable us to get more power at a lower fuel burn. And of course, some of these come with teething pains, like the geared turbofan, the issue that we have with I think this last count is like over 700 aircrafts are parked because of engines that need to be checked and require maintenance. So new technology is always takes time to be adopted. So I do think that there's definitely capabilities, and ultimately it is transferring an energy source into something that gives you enough power that the aircraft, it's a heavy tube, can basically beat gravity. And that's kind of the I mean, and I'm not a physicist, so this is what
I have to say, Remco, I used to look out the window flying these things and think, well, I understand the physics, but it's still magic.
Yeah,
it's still, and how all this actually hangs together and keeps us airborne is still magic.
Yeah, so it is a bit about it's kind of what is the density of power that can drive these engines forward, and how heavy would that be? And then also, of course, obviously with aircraft being up in the air 35, 40,000 feet, can we manage and control this in a safe manner? Well, that's going to take a while. And in a while, I mean decades, in my view. Yeah. And so we still have the current engines, and they keep evolving, and these problems that I alluded to will be overcome, and then the next batch will be without any major issues, I would expect. If you think about what we touched upon earlier, so the replacement for the wide bodies that have been delivered so far, with a big peak a decade ago, in the years to come. So let's say early 20s, a lot of these aircraft will need to be replaced, and all of that capacity is still on conventional, very much improved power plants at Rolls-Royce and General Electric and CFM and Pratt & Whitney. And that's basically the technology that is evolved and it's gotten better and more fuel efficient.
So how do you see this gap in this tremendous pent-up demand and therefore potentially significant value from investment? How do you see that being matched in a manner that actually sustains the investment and the demand and doesn't create some alternative avenue for that demand to channel? How does the airline industry deal with the fact that it's been choked at the supplier and that they can't get enough airplanes? And yet you've got this huge market there screaming for additional capacity. How does that work?
Well, I think prices will go up. That's how that
you heard it here first.
Yeah, that's normally how that works. No, I do think that, of course, we are also coming out of a period whereby the whole industry was set back because of the pandemic, and that also shareholders thought, hey, wait a minute, there are global developments, and in this case, it was a pandemic that greatly negatively impacts, let's say, in economic terms, the return on capital, right? So then people, investors, owners become more careful, and they slow it down a bit. And now this year we're back at the 2019 level, and so now basically we can pick it up again and grow again. What will need to happen, obviously, is that and it'll have an effect on the maintenance, repair, overhaul business. We'll probably have to keep flying with aircraft a bit longer, and that, of course, is then very much. And we've already seen that happening in the sense that 2020, a lot of airlines post-COVID, basically both when the COVID started, said we're going to park these Airbus A380s forever. And a lot of them have come back. Not all of them have come back. I mean, there's 251 are built. There's probably around, say, 50 are parked or have been parted out, so no longer in use. But quite a few airlines decided to keep flying with them after all because they needed that capacity. The Airbus 340 family, Lufthansa, is still flying with A340s.
The 600, which is the airplane I flew, was largely farmed off. Actually, in this sort of environment where you've got this mismatch between capacity and demand, strikes me that it has a role to play potentially.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. And also, what you see is that, for instance, US, United and Delta, still fly with 767s, which are the latest one.
Yes.
That was delivered to them was 20 to 23 years ago. Yeah. So they average 30 plus years. In their markets, where they have customers that are willing to pay a premium for comfort. So how they configure these aircraft is basically it's a 3 or 4 class setup, and they use them both domestically and internationally. And so despite say the relative low fuel efficiency versus a much newer A350, they still have a role to play. I think also in the future you'll see we have no choice to keep flying with the aircraft, and where of course some airlines have a strategy to say 15 years you're out of here. I'm going to renew my fleet. That won't. I mean, there's more demand, and the big, of course, driver of this will be what will the oil price do? So what will the global oil market evolve over time? Of course, now it is because Trump has asked OPEC to produce more. I mean, if it stays at, I think Brent was at $68 a barrel this morning. If it stays at that level, it'll be very nice for the industry because that is a level that they can make.
Well, I think by comparison, I think we got up to 130 a barrel.
Yeah.
And
at a certain point, we did,
and that is ruinous. Interesting, isn't it, that so many of those 747s were junked, parted out, flown to the desert, and yet we've got this. Maybe the solution is in the desert, isn't it, or part of the solution? But how interesting at the point where we're looking at, and this is March 2025, we're looking at potential nascent trade wars going on, where you've got China with clearly the expertise to build aircraft. and the capacity to the choking of supply from the manufacturers, and no one's really sort of talking to each other. It's all gone very polarized. Yeah. So tell me, Remco, how do you see what do you see for 2050? What's the big picture you see for the global airline industry, and the demand supply mismatch and the supply chain issues that we've been looking at? How does it look?
And so from a capacity point of view, you'll see a move to the east, at least from our point of view, so to Asia, and also to South, so Africa in particular. I think the Middle East carriers are extremely well positioned, given where they sit geographically, to continue to enable a lot of that demand, because the capability, or even though the market will grow quite fast out of Africa, it's forecasted to be, let's say, 4.5% per year for the next 2 decades by IATA, but it comes from at a low base. Asia will grow even more. It will grow at more than 5%, but it's already a pretty well-developed market. Countries like Indonesia, India, Vietnam, maybe to a lesser extent Pakistan, whose population will grow, but at a much lower wealth level right now, will continue to increase in demand. And a lot of that will be picked up by developing local carriers, but also by Middle East carriers who are, let's say, geographically have a great position to pick that up. And then I think in Africa, like Egypt, which are growing, and also Morocco, but Egypt has a much larger population, will continue to grow, I think, outpace the rest of that continent. And if you look at why people travel, and people have to have a reason to travel, and obviously into the Middle East, from the Middle East, there's a lot of religious traffic. So let's say Cairo, Jeddah is already one of the largest city pairs in the world. And I think that will continue. And what is interesting, let's say at a crossroad, what do I develop in the sense from, say, bilateral country point of view? Do I invest in rail, an alternative, or do I keep investing in air? I mean, it's quite easy once the infrastructure is there to add aviation capacity. Yeah. And what strikes me is that you look at some of the busiest city pairs in air traffic develop so quickly because of a lack of an alternative. Like I said earlier, okay, people on islands travel more than people on mainlands, and had the Channel Tunnel never been built, then even more Brits would continue to fly, clearly, and have taken the ferry. But for instance, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, it's only 400 kilometers, but there's no high-speed rail, and it is a hugely busy city pair. Yeah. For instance, Singapore to Kuala Lumpur, same. And you would hope, maybe hope for the planet, that more development in rail as well. If you look at Africa as a whole, 80% of all the rail tracks are in 3 countries: Morocco, Egypt, and South Africa. Because, to build a rail network that connects the dots requires a very coordinated effort and a huge amount of capital.
And a lot of inflexibility in terms of alternative routings.
Correct. Yeah, correct. I think in Africa, they still have to determine what gauge, how wide the track that they want to stick to. But it can be done. Of course, it requires a huge amount of capital. I mean, I think China has done it very, very successfully. You have a fantastic domestic high-speed rail system, as has Japan and France and many other countries. But you still have a lot of flights as well, because I mean, the demand for communication, for seeing each other, is continues to be there.
So it seems, if I'm picking this up correctly, we're going to be seeing a lot of legacy aircraft running through to 2050 using the trusted technologies. You've got sustainable aviation fuel, which will be potentially coming online and is coming online, but the infrastructure is needed to support that. Absolutely. But you're principally going to see the same sort of power plants powering airplanes, certainly through 2050, potentially hydrogen-fueled or hybrid-fueled aircraft coming online from about 2035, 2040 onwards?
Yeah, possibly. To certify an aircraft on existing technology, that takes years. So let alone the certification of new technology would take a long time. Take a long time.
And so really, it's the first hurdle is going to be overcoming the supply and capacity, the capacity and demand mismatch through the supply chain. And that we think might be emerging from COMAC and the BRICS kind of environment at the aircraft manufacturing infrastructure. Is that what we're thinking here?
Well, I think that will play a contributing role, but that will also take a lot of time, especially on the wide body side. So I don't think that COMAC or any other country, any other supplier than the main two will have wide body aircraft ready anytime soon. And then, I mean, not for another decade and a half.
Unless they go joint venture with one of the other manufacturers.
Yeah.
One of the global manufacturers.
But then they would start, basically, by learning from an existing frame, an existing blueprint that is already there.
Certainly my sense is that China and the COMAC experiment is going to be about distancing itself from the potential geopolitical risks of using non-Chinese suppliers and having its own internal capacity, not only in microchips, but also in aircraft and anything else that matters. So I think that's going to be in a very interesting dynamic. So overall, a massively expanding airline and air travel market, with certainly quite a few challenges, not least in terms of supply and in terms of modernization of power plant and what fuels those power plants.
Yeah, I think also if you look at, let's say, also the supporting infrastructure, so you have to develop airports, develop civil aviation oversight capabilities in all of these countries, and then it will start with local flows first. So, I mean, domestic, so Lagos to Abuja will grow and develop a lot more than Lagos to New York. That's just not realistic, let alone, let's say, Lagos to a South American country. And so once that is in place, it will start to evolve over time. And so, okay, good news for pilots. There's I think a tremendous continued demand for engineers, particularly in the global market demands that older aircraft will have to fly longer. So that means that the maintenance of spare parts and ensuring that they're all serviced and certified for, let's say, older generation.
With certified parts?
Yeah, 777s and A380s or Airbus 330 family aircraft, they will have to stick around a bit longer because the output for new aircraft is not quick enough. And I think also there to basically ensure that the track record of aviation when it comes to safety stays at the incredibly high standard it is. And also the development of the training. And training is hugely important here, ensuring that the oversight is also guaranteed and continue to be at the level it is right now. Because that's ultimately what everybody wants. You want to ensure that wherever you go in the world, there's never any infringements on safety and compliance.
Yeah, and we can have a discussion about single pilot operations and the wisdom and desirability of that in another conversation.
Well, I mean, it could be that. Sorry, let's park that for.
That's another chat.
Yeah,
that's another chat. Very interesting, Remco. Very interesting one to be continued. So from Remco and from me, that's our quick high-level view of the 2050 perspective for the airline industry. The question is, who's going to make profit? What are the investment returns going to be like? And that's one for another conversation. Remco, thank you very much indeed. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Barry. Appreciate it. It was nice talk.
Many thanks for listening to our Just Great People podcast. And you can really help us. Please do remember to like and subscribe, and please share this podcast with everybody you know. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you. So that's it for today's Just Great People podcast from the Success Consultancy. We hope and trust you've enjoyed it. Please join us next time, and please do remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining us.